Fact checkers, the following comes directly from the 26-page Uluru Statement from the Heart and the 86 pages from the 12 dialogues held to create the statement, delivered only after a Freedom of Information request. You can check this for yourselves. I've read all 112 pages several times now. The Voice is part of the Uluru Statement. The statement calls and wants for a black-only parliament, a black-only political party, a black constitution, an Aboriginal constitution, the creation of new states and territories, a pan-Aboriginal state, state powers, lots of designated seats in government, an elected assembly with its own constitution, a defined territory made up of Aboriginal-owned or native title lands, which could lead to, quote, representation at the United Nations. Truth is truth-telling. Truth-telling is needed to achieve reparations to resolve unfinished business. That's with a capital U and a capital B. Unfinished business is anything bad that happened since Captain Cook set foot in Botany Bay, end quote, and comes from quotes such as this: I want to see us continue the decolonisation of Australia, end quote. Acknowledging Aboriginal people were here first is not wanted. However, acknowledging that the British were not colonisers but they were invaders, murderers and rapists, end quote, is part of truth-telling and allows for the last 250 years to be deemed illegal. Constitutional acknowledgement of this truth enables the legality of colonisation and therefore the later creation of Australia to be challenged through a class action from First Nations, as specified in the dialogues. Treaty is Makarrata. Makarrata is another word for treaty or agreement making that comes from the package of self-determination and is the, quote, culmination of their agenda, end quote. Self-determination is a guiding principle from the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and means that, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to enforcement of treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, end quote. Self-determination involves gaining political and economic power, and especially rights to lands, territories and resources through treaties after, quote, substantial constitutional change and structural reform, end quote. After a treaty negotiating framework is enshrined in the Constitution, a Makarrata Commission will supervise truth-telling and all subsequent treaties. Treaty commissions and a council will be set up with the idea being that, quote, the body could help with the fight, pushing for whatever we want to get, end quote. There will be treaties among Aboriginal tribes, nations to set boundaries, treaties with local, state and federal governments, and then a treaty with every single First Nation down the track, meaning hundreds of, quote, substantive nation-by-nation agreements with First Nations and governments, end quote. Everything will be funded by reparations. Treaty reparations include land and sea rights, water rights, subsurface rights, airspace and allodial titles, a percentage of GDP, rates, land tax, royalties and tariffs, or other forms of monies levied from people for, quote, going on to country, end quote. Treaties will not cancel out existing agreements and benefits already in place. The idea is that the many annual billions spent on Aboriginal affairs will continue but be controlled by Aboriginal people only. An open checkbook was suggested to take back and look after their kids. There are other ideas such as a rent-to-buy scheme for housing, relief from land taxes and an Aboriginal community-controlled housing peak body. And multinational corporations and perhaps corporations will have to pay the rent. Non-Aboriginal Australians take responsibility for truth-telling history, i.e. through reparations. Reparations are for past criminal acts, but also, quote, compensation for present and future criminal acts, end quote. This all equates to sovereignty. Sovereignty also comes from laws. Jurisdictions on First Nation law will be recognised to, quote, create far-reaching structural reform, end quote. As it states, there are, quote, 260 existing unwritten Aboriginal constitutions, end quote. These would be acknowledged and they come with unique, quote, rules, policies and procedures of governance, end quote. A prohibition on racial discrimination means veto power on laws seen as detrimental to Aboriginal people, with the word race being replaced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as this law, quote, should be only for First Peoples, end quote. Another relevant quote, "We are not part of multiculturalism, we are the First Nations." A First Nations Parliament will draft legislation, hand this to the Australian Parliament, and Aboriginal lawyers can influence High Court decision-making on cases involving Aboriginal issues. We are reminded in the document that the High Court recognised land rights back in 1992, so there's a fair bit of power in influencing the High Court judges. International human rights lawyers and agencies can assist when deemed necessary. Quote, "There is a potential for the two sovereignties to coexist in which both Western and Indigenous values and identities are protected and given voice in policies and law," end quote. So the Australian system and the Aboriginal system will each have a voice. There is considered talk about changing the Australian flag, statue removal, Australia Day becoming the annual day of mourning, cultural sensitivity training for non-Aboriginal Australians, truth-telling and learning about the resistance fighters may become compulsory in education, and young Aboriginal people need all of the above reparations to become, quote, "the future activists and warriors," end quote. All of the above are changes to fix the day-to-day lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Share this video to people who don't have time to read through the 112 pages. If you want to read through the pages, please go to truearrowevents.com. Hope that helped. Thanks for watching.